sounds like an oxymoron, the no price sale. So what is a no price sale, and does it actually make sense to have one? Well, let's just think about what the current situation typically is. Quoting. I'm going to suggest to you that quoting price is a bad idea. Other than published list price, that is, of course, you need to be able to quote that. And what I mean by quoting is quoting a price unless you're absolutely certain it's the right price and it's the price that's going to win. And if you've got doubts about that, well, then if you've got any good reasons why it's a good idea, I mean, why should we quote? So to validate my argument, I'm just going to give you a few reasons why I think it's really not a good idea to quote and what happens when we quote. So 99 times out of 100, 80 times out of 100, 70 times out of 100, whatever it is, whatever the statistic is for you, I would suggest that you're often unsure what to quote. You might base it on your list price or your something or other, but oftentimes you don't actually know what the buyer is really expecting. And if you do, then I'd suggest that's more of an offer than a quote. And so anyway, you quote. And the problem with that is the chances are you're going to get a price objection because whatever it is, the price isn't what the buyer expected. And it's more or less in the buyer's book of rules, isn't it, that you object to a price. None of us accepts the first price these days. We're in a discounting society, discounting culture. We just expect that whatever price comes first, there's something better if we were to negotiate it. But what happens then is once you get a price objection, the buyer-seller dynamic fundamentally changes because then you have to justify and defend your price. Now, before that, before you quoted, you no doubt went through exploration, discovery to understand the buyer's needs, and that was, you know, an engaging type of a conversation. However, as soon as price is on the table, then there's a shift from potentially working collaboratively, understanding the buyer, to you're kind of in sales mode, having to justify and defend what you've offered. And by definition, it wasn't what they expected. And that's why you find yourself now in negotiation mode. And I don't know about you. There's lots of programs, courses, numerous books written on negotiation. And I've spent a lot of my time in sales negotiating, but frankly, I'd just as soon avoid it if I could, right? So what tends to happen then is 9 times out of 10, you run up the white flag and you end up discounting. And the problem then is you lose price credibility because the buyer's sort of thinking, well, clearly the first price you gave me wasn't the right price. You could have done better. Why didn't you give me that in the first place? So now I know that whenever I deal with you, that I need to, you know, ask you for a discount. So then you've established a price cutting precedent. And with that particular buyer, at least, they're going to expect you to discount from there on. And kind of rinse and repeat, that process continues. So that is the sort of quoting paradigm. And I would suggest if you've got any different experience, I'd love to know about it. So there's some personal hurdles to do with that. Ask yourself, how do you feel engaging with buyers in this way? I mean, and the hurdles are, there's that anxiety. What should I quote? You know, I'm firing a gun down a dark alley and I don't know, I can't see a target, I'm not going to hit anything. Maybe a bad metaphor, you're not trying to kill anyone. The problem is, though, that you don't know if you're going to hit a target. And then you're going to have to handle objections. You sort of know that. But how do you feel about that? You might have learned about how to do that, but still, it's by definition, you're saying things the buyer doesn't agree with. So you've got that sort of tension occurring. And then you're justifying and defending. You're into pitching. You're into needless negotiation. And I say needless because what if you didn't have to negotiate? I mean, you just as soon not have to do it. If you offered something and the buyer said, yes, I'll buy it, why? It'd be great, wouldn't it? So you wouldn't have to negotiate. And there's tension that's all of that creates. And then you're having to restore your credibility because you quoted something that was more than you were prepared to do the business for, and that put a dent in your credibility in the buyer's eyes, right? And the whole thing's a time suck. So, you know, what proportion of your quotes actually end up in deals? Do you actually end up closing? It's one of the most common ways to get rid of a salesperson is for a buyer to say, "Oh, send me a quote." So you go away and you do all the work and you send a quote and nothing comes of it. So they're just a huge time suck. Do you enjoy all of that? Or if you could avoid it, how would that be? And that's what the topic is today. I'm going to talk about how you can avoid it. So you're probably wondering, well, why me? What gives me credibility to talk about this topic? So first of all, I've spent a lifetime in sales, and yeah, that's me on the left there a few years ago. And I'm probably a bit unique insofar as I grew up wanting to be a salesperson. That was the only ambition I ever had. My father was a salesperson, and I decided I wanted to be a salesperson. Not too many people, I don't think, have that as an ambition. Now, lifetime in sales for itself doesn't count for anything unless you're learning. And I guess that's what I've done. I've spent a lifetime learning, and more to the point, failing and learning, which is the best way to learn, of course. And in the process, it's all been in the trenches. So whilst I'm running coaching programs now, that hasn't been my life's work. Most of my coaching and training has been with my own sales force, my own people, where I've created a number of high-performance teams, some of whom were, yes, world beaters, in fact. And in that process, you learn a lot, you refine, you adapt. And in that same process, I've been involved with 4 business turnarounds, businesses that were basically tanking as a result of absence of sales, and managed to turn those around. Interestingly enough, with those turnarounds, I didn't lose any salespeople. They went from being non-performers to outstanding performers. So I've got a very deep belief that anyone can sell effectively. Why? Because selling is really about behaving naturally. Selling is about being yourself, not some stereotype, as I'm going to go on and talk about a little bit more. And I also had broad industry experience. So I started out in mining and construction, earth moving, heavy equipment, and then went from there into information technology, enterprise systems, and so on. And over my career, I've ended up working in, I guess, deals from $6,000 to $60 million, just the largest that I've worked in. So I think I've had fairly broad experience, oftentimes quite complex sales, multiple decision makers, and selling from fairly basic products like advertising, soil, right the way through to complex machinery and enterprise systems. And one of the things that I've learned in that is it makes absolutely no difference what the product or the service is, because selling is about buyers. It's not about products or service. You know, it's interesting the number of people I talk to, they think, well, I don't know if that would work in our industry. Our industry has this characteristic. Our industry has that characteristic. Let me tell you the abiding characteristic of any industry. You've got human beings in it. And they're the same human beings, whether they're in mining and construction, information technology, or any other type of industry, okay? So it's about people. It isn't about products or services or anything else. Finally, the methods I'm going to show you are proven. They work. Nothing I'm going to show you is theoretical. It's practical. I can give you practical experiences. Okay, so now a bit of a segue. So what the heck has this got to do with anything? Well, I'll take you there. Take a look at that image and have a look at those lines. Do they appear to be parallel to you or not? I'd suggest that probably they don't appear parallel, right? But here you go. They actually are. That sort of demonstrates it. But even if I take that away, they still don't look parallel to you. Your brain is telling you those lines aren't parallel, even though you know they are. Similarly, how many different colored black and white dots do you see here? Well, let me tell you, there's actually only white dots, but you probably see some black ones as well. So your brain is telling you that you're seeing something that isn't there. Now, the point about this is that our brains and our eyesight have evolved over 300 million years, okay? Our eyesight is an incredibly sophisticated piece of machinery, obviously, and we use it day in and day out with that very high level of use. With that evolution over 300 million years, that constant refinement and perfection, it still makes mistakes. We still see things that aren't there. We still confuse things. We still have optical illusions. So just hold that thought. And now think about people making purchase decisions, investment decisions, evaluating things to buy. How long have we been doing that? Well, I'd suggest we've only been doing it probably for a few thousand years. And we don't do it every day. We use our vision. We only do it occasionally. So what are the chances that we've evolved to do that really well? Well, the chances are that we haven't. We don't do that very well at all. And so I want to introduce you to a guy called Daniel Kahnemann, one of the most eminent psychologists of the 20th century. And in 2002, he won a Nobel Prize, was awarded a Nobel Prize, ironically enough, in economic studies, given he's a psychologist. And he and his partner, Amos Tversky, did a huge amount of research into people. And Daniel, unfortunately, Amos died, but Daniel won the Nobel Prize for his empirical findings challenging the assumption of human rationality prevailing in modern economic theory. That just rolls off the tongue, doesn't it? Make a lot of sense. Let me give you the English translation of that. People make irrational, not logical decisions. You may already know that, but I don't know if you're aware of the extent to which we're irrational. we're 98% of the time operating on autopilot. That is with our amygdala, you know, that lizard, so-called lizard brain, the thing that controls that fight, flight, or fight response. That's in control most of the time. That's what's controlling me at the moment. That's what's controlling you at the moment, listening to this. You're not thinking. You're in autopilot. And you can't do two things at once. You can't listen and you can't think at the same time any more than you can talk and listen at the same time. And that's really important when it comes to our interaction with colleagues and buyers, for example. They're on autopilot and you're on autopilot. And so there's a lot of automatic stuff happening that it's wise for us to take cognizance of. More importantly, there's not as much thinking and logical processing going on as we tend to think there is. We tend to think that oftentimes even companies with their sophisticated processes, that they arrive at decisions, for example, to buy something in a sophisticated, ordered way. In reality, that's not actually the case. Research shows that over 90% of decisions are emotional. And we know that because people that have had the emotional part of the brain damaged are unable to make decisions, okay? So what does that mean? Well, Kahnemann came up with the idea of cognitive bias, distortions of reality through which we view the world. So again, we're irrational most of the time. Now, let's just have a look at some of these cognitive biases, and there's hundreds of them. An important one, fundamental attribution error. What that means is that we tend to attribute people's behavior to their personality or their character. But our behavior, we attribute to the situation. We're rational. We think we're rational and act according to the situation. Everyone else, well, it's a function of their, if they're late to work or something, that's because they're slack, not because of a situation. We have this fundamental attribution error. Similarly, the halo effect. The halo effect is the lens through which we first see someone through is the lens through which we continue to see them. So, for example, you rock up on the doorstep and you're like a traditional salesperson. I've stereotyped you, which I'm going to talk about in a minute, and that's the lens I see you through. And if you make a really good impression, I'm going to be really impressed with you. You make a lousy impression, that's the lens I'm going to keep looking through. Even if you do something really good, I'm going to think it's an accident because I've got a lousy impression of you. On the other hand, if I had a good impression of you and you did something not good, I'd cut your break. And so that's why it's really important how we create that first impression. You know the power of the first impression. Everyone knows that. But sometimes we underestimate just how powerful it is. Confirmation bias, we tend to believe what we want to believe, okay? In other words, we tend to drink our own bathwater, to use an expression. And we tend to seek out information and sources that reinforce our own existing beliefs. And so that's similar to the status quo bias, which is the thing that we resist change. As a matter of default, we humans resist change. Why? That's that amygdala again, that 300 million years of evolution. Our first instinct is to stay safe. Change is, by definition, risky. It may not work. It may be unsafe. Back in the day, it meant going outside our cave and maybe getting eaten by a tiger or going into some new location that we hadn't been to before. That was risky. And so we tended to not want to do that. And so we very much have this tendency to not want to change. And it's important to realize that is hardwired. So better the devil we know than the devil we don't. And all of these cognitive biases, by the way, even though we know about them, even though we can be educated about them, we can't do anything about them. We still suffer from them. Okay, it's just like those optical illusions. The same thing happens with a magician. You know that can't happen. You know they can't elevate that person, but you're seeing it. Even so, that's what it looks like to you. And it's important to appreciate that's what's going on in people's minds when you're interacting with them and then making decisions. Finally, the stereotyping. So if you rock up, okay, 98% of people don't trust salespeople. You're probably not surprised by that. You probably don't trust salespeople. So bottom line, you don't want to be seen like a salesperson. Notwithstanding you are a salesperson, I'm a professional salesperson. I'm really proud of my profession. But I don't want to be seen as a stereotypical salesperson, which is the paradigm that people have in their head. So when I meet them for the first time and interact with them, I need to ensure that that is not the stereotype they have in their head. They need to have a stereotype that's about me. It's about Patrick. That's a perception I want them to have. And so I have to overcome that bias. Or more to the point, I don't want to fuel the bias, okay? I can't make them get rid of the bias about salespeople, but I can make sure that it's not applied to me by the way I behave. Finally, the IKEA effect. the IKEA effect is that we place high value on things that we contribute to ourselves. You know, we put something together with the IKEA key. We value it. We feel really good about that bookshelf because we put it together ourselves, more than we would just a bookshelf that we hadn't built. And so that's really important, again, interacting with buyers in terms of their commitment to solutions they create themselves rather than to solutions that, for example, you just give them or sell them. So what's the bottom line in all of this? Well, Mark Twain, one of my favorite sages, had a great expression, and this really applies to salespeople. It ain't what you don't know that gets you into trouble, right? We tend to think it is, that we don't know something. The real problem is it's what we know for sure that just ain't so. They're the assumptions that we tend to make. And we have an awful lot of assumptions because of these cognitive biases in terms of how we deal with buyers. One is, well, I can't say no to quoting. We tend to think because the buyers ask for a quote, we should give them a quote. It doesn't occur to us, well, actually, we can just say no. And you know what? Nothing happens. The world doesn't end. I'll go through that in a minute. So let's go through the no price sequence, the alternative sequence to the one I showed you before. And the first step is the no, to provide a valid reason to not quote. You know, the buyer's just asked you for a quote. So the response then is, well, if you didn't quote, there's no price to discuss. There's nothing to object to. There's nothing to negotiate, right? So two options: give them a quote and I'm going to have all of this pain, or not quote and I don't have that pain. So all I've got to figure out is how to say no. That, I would suggest, is an easier thing to figure out than it is to have to deal with the pain of what goes later. And so we're just going to focus now on how to say no. Having done that, you want to then transition the conversation from price, because you're not going to have a price to talk about, and go to value instead and have a conversation about that. And that involves exploring buyer perceptions of value. What is it that buyers value? That's what a value conversation is about. So take Philip here, for example, who sells security in New Zealand, security systems, cameras and back to base and all that kind of stuff. Now, he used to operate in a way that he would tour their premises, they'd take him around, and then he'd give them a quotation. Now, though, he doesn't do that. He said we have a conversation with them about what feeling safe feels like to them. What does it need for them to feel safe? Then they feel comfortable with him. They come to trust him and they give him the job. Most of the time without asking for a quote, because they've just come to trust him. And his sales are up 30% since he started to do that. So having thought the buyer's perceptions of value, the next bit is inventing the buyer's solution, which is a collaborative process to work with the buyer to invent their solution. They're involved in that process. You're not presenting it, you're inventing it. Remember that IKEA key thing, the commitment to something they create themselves? Okay, and then when you've done that, then you offer a product or service that fits the solution. So it's not a quotation, it's an offer that matches quite specifically what you and they have cooperatively invented. So let's see how we actually do that. We're going to take a different path here. So if the traditional sales path is off to the left there, up a bit of an incline, it's a bit harder than the path down the right-hand side, which is a decline, it's downhill, but it's narrow because, heck, less than 5% of salespeople even go down there, and it's a lot quicker to get there. Most salespeople trudge up the one to the left. And the one up to the left is about needs. We have needs conversations, right? Or explorations. And that results in requirements, which are things like products or services, and they have utility and functionality. Typically, they have a specification. It might be formal. They have a budget, and they're tangible. You know, you can touch them and see them, and they get priced and they get quoted. That's the world we tend to operate in. And that is the how, the buyer's how. This is the how they're going to solve their problem or their issue or whatever. That's what we tend to focus on. But what caused the need for a how? It's their why. Why do they need to do it? And that's the value column. And this is where top performing salespeople spend their time. That's 7% of salespeople that win more than 70% of their business. They operate in the value column. Because the value column is about results and outcomes. It's about the why I need to do that. I need to get higher revenue, lower costs, increased production, less waste, greater. You can imagine the types of things. It's a conversation about results and outcomes is what a value conversation is about. And buyers really enjoy that conversation, more so, in fact, than the needs conversation. The problem with needs is, and I'll talk about it later, is they have a sense that you're just going through that because you want to figure out what you might be able to sell them. Here, there is no sense of that. You're genuinely interested to understand where they want to go. And so you could say the needs are inputs, okay, that provide that value, that let them get that value. And so if you take, for example, Adrian here, he's a professional photographer, commercial photographer, takes photographs of products and buildings and people's executives. His world used to be people asking him to take N images of whatever, and he'd submit a quote, and then 9 out of 10 times he wouldn't hear back from them. You know, it was just a price. Now he starts a conversation with them, a value conversation, and asks, well, what's the impression do you want to create? How do you want people to feel when they see the images? No one's ever asked them that before. They've never even thought about it. They thought, I just need images. I said, well, what is the response you want? How will you know it's work? What is the outcome? What is the result? So he has that conversation, and they come to trust him. And as a result, now he's found his sales are up 30, 40%. He wastes a whole lot of time not quoting people because that was just took a lot of time up. And he's winning bigger deals as well, just by focusing on the outcome or the results they want. They don't want photographs. They want more sales, or they want to create a positive impression of themselves as a business or whatever. It's not the images. Sorry, it's not the photos. It's the image that they're projecting. That's what he's tapped into. So returning back to our twin paths here, let's look further into this value. Here's the thing about value. Value is received. Value can't be given, can't be sold, can't be proposed, can't be added, can't be created. Now, that might be a revelation because we talk about value propositions, we talk about adding value, creating value. You can't do that stuff. Think about it. And I might be treading on some sacred cows here, but frankly, I don't care. Value is what you get. You could say value is what you're left with after the salesperson has left. So value is what you get after you bought the new suit and you go walking around in it and people admire and say, geez, that's a great suit. That looks good on you. Whatever. That's value. Okay. It's not the salesperson didn't give you that. You got that from the product they sold you. So vendors sell you products and sell you services. That value is what you get as a result. If you buy a new house, you don't move into it. They've satisfied the need. You bought the house. There's no value there, not until you move in it. You watch the kids playing around, they're jumping in and out of the pool, you're enjoying entertaining on the patio. That is value. And so the object of being effective in sales is to understand what that feeling is that buyers want and to be seen as the agent that's going to give them that value. That is the key to winning a sale. It's not about meeting the needs. And so it gets down to an individual level, even in business. Whilst those were organizational outcomes I spoke about before, the individual outcomes of the people. I mean, an organization is a group of people, right? It's not just an edifice. It's not an amorphous mass. Each of the buyers, each of the decision makers has their perceptions of value. Is it job security, autonomy, authority, the paycheck, reduce stress, reduce the workload, advancement? These are the things that people buy. And if you don't believe that, just think for a moment. Can you imagine any buyer, any decision maker making a decision to purchase decision that will, for the company, even if it's in the company's best interest, that will cost them their job? No. We all act in our own best interest. Again, refer back to the cognitive biases and how we behave and how we see the world. Our fundamental instinct is to be safe. Our fundamental instinct is to look after us, ourselves, and also those closest to us, our immediate family, for example, and nurture them. So, and our company doesn't fit into that. We work to satisfy our personal needs and personal value. That's ultimately the driver, and that's the things you need to discover. So it's a case of taking a mind shift, becoming effective doing this process, moving from how, about products, services, the present, what is my problem right this minute, problems, challenges, requirements, and whatever, and going to the why. Why? What is the business outcome? What is the future? Where do I want my business to go? What is the result and outcome? Where do I want my department to go or my work team to go? So therefore, it's broader in view. You're not just focusing on your product or service. You're not just looking, for example, about a new truck. You're looking at, well, what will the truck be used for? What will be the impact on your business when you have that? Or you're not just looking at the house in terms of how many bedrooms and bathrooms or whatever. It's a case of understanding the buyer's lifestyle. How do you want to enjoy this place? What's it going to be like? So you can distinguish what it is that is of value to that. That's why needs are generic. You could have any number of houses, for example, will fit the needs, well, for the specification, number of bedrooms, whatever. But what makes them unique? Well, it's the buyer's perception. It's the stuff they feel. It's not down there in the specification anywhere half the time. It's how they feel when they walk around it. That's what good salespeople understand, how to understand what that impression, that person, how the experience of that person is going to be, experiencing value. And then they just show them something that gives them that. And it's about value. It's about understanding the desired future state then, and then comparing that to the current state. So we look at the future. What does the future look like to you? Then the current state, where are we at now? And the difference between them is a value gap. Okay, so what buyers want to do is plug the gap. What you want to help them do is, what is it that's needed to get you from this present state to your future state? Whereas needs, bear in mind, we're tending to talk about the current state. So we're sort of going backwards, looking in a very vision mirror. All right, and then we're talking about sources of value. What is it that you need to have that's going to give you value rather than a specification? So the how mindset arrives at a quotation. The why mindset arrives at a solution. All right, so getting started now on this no quote process, no price process. How do you say no? Well, here's a way. Mary, I'm keen to make you an offer that will knock your socks off for value. So it's not an explicit no. You're saying, yeah, look, I'm keen to make you an offer, but here's the thing. I don't just want to give you a price or a quote. I want you to have value. Who doesn't want value? And then, but I'm not quite sure yet. I just know how to do that. I'm going to need to know more about you. Okay, so I'm not in a, and it's the truth. I don't know how to come up with a quote. Why would I give you a quote and you're not going to buy it? That doesn't make sense, does it? So I better find out exactly what it is and know whether or not you'll buy it, and then I'll quote that. And if I can't match what you want, then I'm better off not quoting. Doesn't that make so much more sense than just quoting anyway? And so what Mary says is, yes, Patrick, what would you like to know? And that happens every time. I've been doing this for 30 years. I've never had a knockback. I mean, what are they going to knock back? Yeah, fine, that's good. It's only our mental frame that says, oh, they've asked for a quote, I better give them one. No, you don't. You just give them a really good reason why you shouldn't. Now, I'm off and running in a value conversation because the price is off the table now. And so now we have a conversation about value. So let's have a look at how value conversations work. And first and foremost, they're natural. They're like with friends. Now, I'm not suggesting you do this in a coffee shop. You may well do that, of course, have the odd conversation. I'm using the coffee shop model as a metaphor for the style of interaction, you know, where it's relaxed and like you talk with your friends. You want the same engagement with buyers, exactly the same. Person to person, not salesperson to purchasing officer or CIO or warehouse manager or whoever else you might, CEO, whoever. It's you want it to be Patrick and Bob, Patrick and Mary, Patrick and Bill, person to person. And so it's buyer focused. You focus on them and you use language like you, not I, we. You're not talking about yourself, because talking about yourself is self-interest. Nothing undermines trust more than talking about yourself. Ironic. Salespeople know they need to grow trust. And you can't grow trust. Trust is a result. It's an outcome, right? You can't do trust. Trust happens. It's a feeling people get about you. The interesting thing is the one thing that undermines trust is self-interest. It makes sense, right? So you mention your product, you talk about your company, you talk a bit about yourself. What's that? Self-interest. So salespeople, almost from the get-go, start undermining trust. So don't talk about that. Talk about the buyer. Now, what makes you feel someone cares about you? It's when they ask about you, isn't it? They get you talking. So, well, how was that? What made you feel? Oh, that would have been terrible. Then what happened? You feel cared for. You start to trust that person. That's what the style of conversation is in a natural conversation. So be curious, be interested in the buyer and use their language, buyer language, no brands, no jargon. So you're talking about, wow, sounds like you need a 2-ton truck rather than you need a Ford Transit. Because a buyer can sort of agree with you that, yes, I need a 2-ton truck. But if buyers having to agree to a Ford Transit, which is what you're selling, feels like they're committing. They can't say yes to that, right? They're not ready to commit to that. So long as you stick to generic language, you can find out exactly what it is the buyer's interested in and get sign off on it. So they're conversations, not interrogations. You know, salespeople are trained to sort of go in with an agenda, with a whole set of questions. What does that feel like from a buyer's point of view? It feels more like an interrogation, doesn't it? Like, I'm going to ask my questions, something to be endured rather than enjoyed. And we usually start off and say, well, I'm keen to understand you, so I know exactly what you need. What the buyer hears is, I just want to ask you a bunch of questions so I can find out what to sell you. There's nothing genuine about that process. So you just have a conversation. No list of questions. People say, oh, how can you have a meeting with a buyer with no list of questions? Well, you can, because you know generally where you want to go. You don't have a list of questions when you go and talk to your friends. You don't sort of say, well, hang on, Mary, let me just go through my agenda here. No, you kind of know where you're going to go, and the conversation goes organically and dynamically. You know the topics, you know the direction you want to head. That's why you're having a meeting or a conversation. And it's the same here. So the object is keep the buyer talking, because as long as the buyer's talking, you are growing trust, because you are showing care, you're demonstrating care, you're interested in them. So hang on every word the buyer is saying. Now, the problem with most salespeople is that the problem they have asking questions is they're thinking of the next question, they're not listening to the answer of the previous one. We can't do two things at once, right? We cannot listen and we can't think of another question. So our mind's on the sale, it's on various other things. You will find if you just hang on every word the buyer is saying, the next question will emerge. It takes practice, though. You've got to get used to doing this, and I'll talk about that in a little bit. And so the style of questions you ask buyers is, so what does value look like? And the first question, the best question you ask is, why? Why do you want to, a new production line? Why do you need a new building? Why do you need a new truck? Why? Start with why. And then the buyer will tell you about that, and you say, okay, so if you get the results you want, it's working the way you want, what does that look like? Now, these are randomized. They're not necessarily in any particular order, but these types of questions come out based on what it is the buyer says. And I said before, it takes practice to do this, and I'll get into that in a minute. But you get the idea. Very small questions, not particularly piercing questions, but they're the sorts of questions that keep buyers talking. And so, okay, so that's the results. So what's preventing that happening now? They're going to start talking about some of the problems and challenges. And so what is the impact of that? And so you're learning about value now. Well, the impact is costing us money or whatever else, or costing machine downtime, wastage, whatever it is. And so, oh yeah, okay, so what's the cost of that? This is all about the buyer, and you'll find that buyers quite happily open up about it. You ask the buyer a budget, they'll clam up because they just think it's you want to sell them something. You have a conversation like this, and what it's costing them, they will happily go into that conversation with you, and you start then getting an insight into potentially what a budget might be, what it's worth to solve it, because you're starting to understand what the cost of it is. And so how do you feel about that? Again, another question we tend not to ask. We tend to ask, well, what do you think about it? That's perception. That's getting their point of view, perception taking. But asking how you feel, that's the empathy question, the emotion then. So, wow, it's causing me a lot of stress, a lot of anxiety. My boss is all over me like a rash. That's what you need to know. So value to that buyer is going to be getting his boss off his back and getting himself under budget or on target or whatever else. That's the type of conversations you're having with people now. And so, well, how do you deal with that? Well, I go and play golf or do something like that. Oh, yeah. So you've got a handicap, so you can then go off into a bit of a social conversation, which balances up the business conversation, which is about how you go about building that relationship and rapport with that buyer, because it's just not all business. It's about concern for the person as an individual. Remember at the beginning I said selling is about people. It's got nothing at all to do with products and services. You engage with people well, you will be able to sell anything. That's a fact. Okay, and I said before, it takes practice and practice. This is a new habit. You can't relate the way you traditionally relate to buyers. Even if you're not trained in selling, you've never sold in your life, we naturally get into sales mode when have a garage sale, people come around, you'll start pitching them. That's what we instinctively do. That's what our natural is to pitch and push. We need to get off that, and it takes practice to break that habit. And the trouble is that salespeople tend not to practice. I mean, would you climb into an aeroplane where the pilot practiced as much as the average salesperson? You wouldn't, would you? Would you climb into a train where the train driver practiced as much as the average salesperson? No. Or a doctor? No. Those professions, we trust them because we know they're practiced and they're really good at their craft. Your salespeople don't. We just go out and we're live performance, and we do the same thing over and over again, and it doesn't work. The problem is that you cannot learn in a live environment. You've got to be able to do it in a practice environment with colleagues, stuff up and correct your behavior and get it right and practice over and over again, so you learn how to ask these types of questions. Otherwise, you'll go on asking the same old questions that all salespeople ask, and you'll be that stereotype. So how much practice? Well, about 2 hours a week, 10% of a working week. If you work 40 hours, that's 10% of a week. And from that, you'll get a 30 to 40% increase in sales, 30, 40% increase in personal revenue if you're based on commission. I can promise you that. I know that works because that's how I developed all my sales teams, is by practice, religiously. I mean, that's how you get good at the piano. That's how you get good at golf. That's how you get good at anything, is just practice and repetition. You get really, really good at this, okay? And particularly the advice to those of you who've never sold before, that's fantastic because you've got no unlearning to do. Practice these techniques. Ironically, it sounds ironic that you have to, as Anita says, seems counterintuitive. You need to learn how to be natural, but you do, because it's not what we naturally do in sales situations. And as she says, it enables her to hone her skills in safety. So when you think about it, it seems ironic to practice to be natural. Think about riding a bike. You had to practice to learn how to do that. Now it's perfectly natural. You had to practice walking. You used to fall on your bum, right? Because you used to crawl. When you had to get up and walk, you had to practice. Then you became good at it. So we do have to practice to become natural. Now, here's a tool that will help you in that conversation with buyers. It's called a value sheet. It's a very simple way of going about solving a problem. It's based on a problem-solving model. Here's the problem. Here's the potential solutions. What are the relative benefits of each of the solutions? So it's just 4 columns, and you can do this with a buyer even. A4 piece of paper, draw it up in 4 columns, and turn a side on, or a letter size, sorry, in the US, piece of paper. So you've already had a conversation about, well, what's this going to look like when everything's working right? And in this case, it's an example of a housekeeper in a hotel. So, you know, you've had a conversation. What's it going to look like? Well, the place is always going to look spotless. The patrons are going to, you know, remark to one another how clean it looks. They're not going to be walking around cleaners, cleaning up stains. The beds are going to be made and they're going to be perfect there. They're not going to have to ring up housekeeping and say, can you bring up some clean towels or so. It's always going to look fantastic. And people are going to sort of, my boss is going to make favorable comments about me because I'm keeping a really good house here. That's what the future looks like. What's your current state like, though? Well, unsightly floors, poor image, constant re-cleaning, customer inconvenience, I appear unprofessional. So a lot of stuff that's not good, a lot of personal stress. I just don't feel comfortable. Okay, so that's the current state. Now we'd start looking for the value gaps. So what's causing that? That's the outcomes. They're the results that you don't want. Well, they're probably using the wrong cleaning agents or poor application. There's a lack of training, insufficient time spent cleaning. I'm not going to go through this whole exercise here. I just want to just give you an illustration of how value conversations go from understanding the future, then what are the gaps in value between the current state and the future, and then what is causing those gaps and what can we do about them. And so then the next thing we do is we go to, in terms of discovering those sources of value, sorry, just going back here again, there's the value gaps. So we're now going to look at, well, okay, what approaches, what solutions, how can we go about solving these problems? And so that's again, more curiosity, more natural conversation, exploring sources of value. So we say, well, what do you think needs to happen? And so, well, you know, I suppose the cleaners need to be better trained, and we might need better chemicals. And then, well, how will that help? Well, they're going to know what to do or whatever. So again, these are sort of out of context because I'm just wanting to illustrate different types of questions, but you can see how this works. It gets the buyer talking. Now, here's the thing. Salespeople often say, I'm here to help you. I want to help you. Let me tell you, people don't want help. People want to be empowered. They want to help themselves. And there's an arrogance in saying, oh, I just need to understand what it is that you need so I can help you. There's an arrogance in that because the first thing is it suggests you can help. How would you know whether you can help until you know what my problem is? And so this whole approach doesn't create, again, that's another bias that people will have against you for beginning that way. This will avoid you falling into that trap. And just while I'm on this topic, all of this stuff, I said we're at 98% on autopilot, right? So people aren't consciously forming these opinions about you. They aren't formally deciding, oh, I want to trust you or I don't trust you. These are feelings that they have that their brain is informing them about, you know, and it impacts their behavior. So this is all happening unconsciously. It's not in a conscious decision process they're going through about whether to trust you, whether to follow you, or whether to believe you. It's a feeling that they end up with. It's really important that we understand that. It's the impression that we create that results in the buyer's behavior, okay? And the cognitive bias that I mentioned before, the fundamental attribution theory, the other thing that we know is that people's situation has a bigger impact on their behavior than their character and their personality. We respond to situations. And so what you're doing as a seller is you're creating situations. You're creating an environment to make it easy for the person to buy. So going on with our conversation. So what if X happened, Mary? Or she responds to that and say, well, what would happen then? And what makes you say that? That's a way of challenging and understanding. What would that be worth to you? Again, you're going through, at every stage, you're sort of trying to get a sense of the cost, not price. That's your language. Cost is buyer language. And how would, and this is how you make a suggestion, how would such and such work? How would it be, you know, if you had a regular if you had a regular training regime here and had some workshops every fortnight or something like that, or you had some basic induction program, you can suggest that these might be services that you provide, but you're doing it in a way that's helping Mary come up with the ideas herself that that's what she needs, okay? So like in the case of Greg Manco, he's consults the fintech industries about marketing strategies, and the revelation for him as he learned this process was he's naturally curious anyway, but he was sort of, one day Gobsmacked, he said, I'm just interacting with him like I'm a human being. He said, I've kind of never done that before. And he had remarkable results. I recall once he was calling a prospect. He was in the US at the time. He's calling a prospect in New Zealand for a 15-minute introductory call. Got off the phone an hour and a half later, and the prospect said, that's the best conversation I've ever had with anyone in sales. And this is the normal feedback. The Adrian that I showed you before, Philip that I showed you before, that's the feedback they get from buyers. No one's ever asked us these questions. No one's ever treated us this way before. You know, they volunteer that just by being natural. So we now can fill out those left-hand columns as you're talking. We're sort of saying, okay, well, descriptive labeling, that would work. Okay, training, coaching program. So out of this natural conversation comes approaches, and then eventually across the right-hand side, we get to the value column. And in terms of, well, what's going to be the benefit? Well, we're going to have fewer errors, improved appearance, and in the case of this person, obviously, with some of those things down on the left-hand side, less stress, more time at home with the kids, I'm going to sleep nights. All of that is value, but you actually start ending it up with it in a column that you can actually agree with the buyer. Does that look right? Okay, now we get to the solution. All right, having done all of that, we then surround the buyer. So, Mary, as I understand it, you need A, B, C, and D, and you need to eliminate X and Y. This is confirmation of what you discovered in that discovery process as you went through the value conversation, you did the approaches, you came up with these potential approaches. You're now saying, Mary, what do you think of these? And you need to do that for under $25,000 a year, because you're talking about costs as well. And she's either going to say yes or no. And if she says no, you say, okay, why is that? So, well, I was hoping to do it for $20,000 a year. So you say, okay, so maybe we need to look at C and D then, Mary. Maybe we need to turn those down a bit or change that. You get in an iterative process until eventually, have I got it right? And she says, yeah, that's right. Okay, so if you could get that, would you buy it? She's going to say yes or no, and you go back through the iteration. Eventually, she's going to say yes. So at that point, you have a generic solution that describes A, B, C, D in Mary's language. And this is where you match your product to that. I call it dovetail. That our model our model X does this. Our such and such a service does that. You match your product to the solution, and there it is. Mary buys it. The point is, she buys her solution. She's not buying your product. That's the IKEA effect. She feels a commitment to it because she invented it with you. So that's the idea. Okay, now, so to wrap up. So Mindshift is a change of habits from understanding needs, quoting, proposing, to understanding perceptions of value, not needs, not quoting, inventing their solution rather than promoting your product. Instead of telling and selling, asking and collaborating, instead of negotiation arriving at consensus, there is no negotiation. You arrive at consensus on the way through. You only get negotiation when someone gets a surprise and you've got to argue about it. And instead of pricing, we're talking about value. So that's it. That's in a nutshell. Now, don't expect you to be able to go out and do that straight away. As I said, it takes practice, and I'm happy to help you do that. There's some resources that you may like to download here, and I'll leave this up on the slide up there. But are there any questions that anyone has? Okay. Any questions? Yes, some coming. A few people typing. Okay, well, while they're typing, if you go to my website, thesalesnatural.com, under resources tab, there's some download guides there that explain the types of things I've been talking about. There are some other resources that I can give you access to if you just ping me, either in LinkedIn, find me there and send me a message, or email me. All of these resources are free, but I don't want to sort of overload you, but some of them go into more depth in terms of how to do this. If you want to ask questions and email me that way, then really happy to help you with that. So no one's got a comment. No one's got a question. Everyone said, okay, that's well explained. That's good. So that's just amazing. So, okay, well, if there is no, so if there are no questions, then thank you very much for participating, joining me in this session. As I said, please just reach out, email me, message me on LinkedIn if you like. Very happy to help any of you if you want to do this. If you want more tangible examples of how it works, specific situations, one that often comes up, here it is. Let's ask the question. Okay, RFPs. Somebody had to ask the question. What do you do in an RFP? You're given a formal RFP, and oftentimes they have the caveat in there that you cannot get in touch with any of the decision makers, any of the buyers, or any of the influencers. Let me tell you what my advice there in that situation is. Basically, I have a rule. If I can't engage with the buyers, then I don't quote. And I've worked with a number of organizations that have very high volumes of RFPs that they need to respond to, both ends of the extreme, large equipment and also working with commodities. Now, here's the interesting thing. My view on that is if you can't get in the position to see the buyer, then my strategy then is to literally derail the RFP process, to sort of get it recalled. And that's a whole range of other strategies that I'm happy to talk about in a separate discussion. But I can cite a number of examples where I've done that. That's typically with very big government contracts. And the approach there is for them to come to the realization that within their RFP, they really haven't catered for everything, that there's some gaps in it, typically because they haven't engaged with with vendors. Or if they have, they've only engaged with one vendor, maybe the incumbent, and they really don't have a big enough broad enough perspective on what they need. And so the approach there is to make them aware of that. And again, it's a case of breaking the rules. Yeah, they said that you couldn't communicate. So what? You find an appropriate person to get to, and you raise this. I mean, what's to lose? You're out anyway. And if you go and tender or go into the RFP without knowledge of them, without being able to engage, I'll tell you what, your chances of winning are minimal anyway. So why bid? And the organizations I worked with have changed their strategy in that way. They're having a much higher success rate. They've actually precipitated the engagement because the buying organization said, well, why won't you bid? Well, because we can't engage. We need to be of value to you. You've given us a spec sheet, but there's another story behind that we don't know about, and we need to know more about it. So please, if we're going to go to the trouble of preparing this proposal, please do us the courtesy of engaging with us. Okay, a question about buyers. When I talk about buyers, I should have clarified that. I'm not talking about buyers in the terms of purchasing officers. I use buyers instead of customers. We often talk in B2B about customers, but a customer is an inanimate object. It's an organization. So a buyer is a collective term I use for a decision maker. So be they CEO, CIO, purchasing officer, personal assistant, whatever they are, anyone that can influence a decision on a purchase, I use the expression buyer, because what I want is that person to buy, whether they're signing the check or not, or whether they're using the product or not. I want them to buy, and I want them to buy me, because if they buy me, then the product comes with it. So yes, I always use the term buyer. So when an average salesperson talks about trust, really good question. I don't think a lot of people really appreciate the definition of trust. Here's a definition of trust for you. And this was by a guy called David Maister, who's credited with coining the expression trusted advisor. You've probably heard of the expression. It's used a lot in sales because that's sort of characterizes a relationship you want. And he defined selling as, he defined a trust equation. And so if you can imagine an equation, so you have a line, and above the line you have credibility, reliability, and intimacy. So credibility is telling the truth. Reliability is doing what you say you'll do. And intimacy is transparency. So tell the truth, be reliable, be open. All those things grow trust. Below the line, the one thing that diminishes trust is self-interest. And that's the thing salespeople display most. The entire traditional selling model is about self-interest. It's obvious that I'm here for my reasons to sell my product. I might, gild it in the way that I'm doing you a favor and helping you, but it's disingenuous. Buyers can see through that a mile away. So it is a case of being genuinely focused on the buyer, which means don't talk about your product or your service. And in my case, I don't talk about it until right at the very end, making an offer. Okay, that's when before then it's a case of getting agreement in generic language on the solution. So I think that the issue with salespeople with trust is to understand they can't build it, they can just behave in a way that the person will come to trust them, become trustworthy. I hope that answered the question. Okay, another really good question. What about gatekeepers and consultants? Okay, so let me ask you a question. What is a consultant's objective? What is a gatekeeper's objective? Think about them as a buyer. This is what's useful. So a consultant's objective, you could say, is to get the client the best job, to advise them to make the best decision. I'd suggest you the consultant's goal is to get another consulting job. Yeah, they want to get more consulting work. So yes, that means doing a really good job where I am and hopefully getting more work. And the gatekeeper, what does the gatekeeper want? The gatekeeper wants to keep their job. The gatekeeper wants to be seen as valuable to their boss. The gatekeeper wants to be seen as doing a good job. So your role as a buyer is to help that person achieve that aim. So a very good example is, for example, with Adrian, the photographer. He typically gets an assistant ringing up and saying, on behalf of the boss, I need, so many images of our building or products. That's typically what happens. Go and get some pictures. Go and get some quotes from a photographer. And so he says, well, what is the impression you want to create? Well, how do you want people to feel? Now, clearly she can't answer that. She says, I don't know. And so then the conversation he has with them is say, well, what I need to do is have a conversation with your boss. And the nature of the conversation is such that she feels good introducing Adrian. So it's a case of, hey, you need to speak to this Adrian guy. He's got a lot of really good ideas. So she looks good in her boss's mind for referring this person, because he's not selling his photographs, right? He's not selling his service. He's not going to do a sales job on you. He's just talking generally about the things we need to think about when it comes to buying images. And so the same thing with consultants. It's a case of the consultant sees you as an ally. And typically, again, there's this combative environment gets set up between sellers and consultants. This, oh my goodness, there's a consultant. Instead of saying, well, hang on a sec, here's another potential ally for us. And look for the wins that person can, what value can you be to that person? What can you do to make their life easier in terms of making recommendations, doing the evaluation, and all the rest of it? Now, how you do that is a longer conversation I've got time for. But again, it shouldn't impact anything. It's yeah. Remember, we're doing business with people. You just want this person to become an advocate. And by him having a personal win in referring you, that he looks really good in terms of suggesting you to his clients, and you come in as an ally. You don't most sellers try to kneecap consultants, get around them, and they do all the wrong things. You, on the other hand, will stand out with the consultant because you're working cooperatively and collaboratively and making them look really good. So, they're going to want to work with you. Anything else? Excuse me as I just have a look through here. So did I answer the RFP quote question? There's more depth. If you want to have more about that, then by all means, contact me offline and separately. I'm very conscious of the time, and I appreciate the time that you've all devoted to this. So thank you very much again. And if you want more information, please contact me. So again, thank you very much for your time. Have a good day. And compliments of the season, and enjoy the festive season. Cheers.